Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well today. Welcome back to Todos Santos. There are a couple empty spots in the city that have been really bugging me. Right here on the tip of the island and right here on the tip of downtown. Now we're going to be focusing today on the downtown area. We're going to completely fill this part in, and it's going to be nice and seamless with the rest of the downtown area. Today we're taking inspiration, not from Latin America like we usually do, not from San Juan, but actually from Portland, Oregon. Now there used to be a freeway that ran along the banks of the Willamette River. And in the 1970s, it was torn down and replaced with Tom McCall Waterfront Park. And we're going to be building our own version of that along the downtown waterfront today. I do have some plans to take inspiration from San Juan for other parts of the city's waterfront. In fact, we're going to be doing a lot of that because obviously there's a lot of waterfront to take care of in this city. But today I wanted to do this build. And it's not just going to involve the park, it's going to involve filling in this whole area, like I said. So we're beginning by having this bridge make a little bit more sense. We're going to give this whole bridge a makeover in a future episode when we get to the other side of the bay. But for now, I just wanted to, first of all, upgrade it to the North American Freeway pack that I've been switching the highways to. And then come over here and start detailing this promontory. Because it was asymmetrical how much land is underneath the bridge on the far side of the bay versus how much land there is underneath the bridge on this side of the bay. So I wanted to make it look a little bit more even by having this little promontory of rocks that the bridge has been built on. I assume this would be like reclaimed land that they've just done because it's cheaper than to like drive giant piles down into the bay. I really don't know how bridges are engineered. That's just my kind of random guess. I'm not a big fan of how the breakwater rocks tile when you copy and paste a bunch of them like this. I think it almost looks a little bit too even. I might come back and replace those with like some tetrapods or something. Those look kind of cool. But for now we're going with this. There's a little bit of like a maintenance road down the middle. It's obviously all wet because it's right near the ocean. It tends to be how things go. Now to get a feel for where the park is going to go, the path it's going to take, I wanted to lay down what would have been the original very wide avenue that would have been here. I'm not thinking it was originally a highway or anything, but just a major arterial road that carried traffic around the end of the downtown peninsula. So what we have here is the old road, the remnants of this part of the road that ran from the small cargo port over into the main part of the downtown. And that was maybe one part that they like ripped up and they were maybe gonna turn into an additional portion of the park or like sell it to developers or something like that, but it just never came through. So we have this old remnant that they're not doing anything with, and it's just kind of a grassy, unused part of the shoreline. It's possible there were some unintended consequences to this project, even though overall I imagine that would have been pretty successful. I'm thinking this road that I'm drawing out along here, again, just to get a sense of where the park is going to go, probably connected up with the bridge that hooks the freeway up to the small cargo port. So this originally would have been the main way to get from the north-south freeway over here to the southern shore of the downtown peninsula. And so in severing that connection, they have forced a lot of people to go down the central avenue, which of course is always being pretty congested, but at least it reclaims the waterfront for the pedestrian. Another aspect of that is that up here, bridging from the peninsula to the Old Town Island, there used to be a bridge here as well. And this has been torn down in the process of creating this park. Not completely torn down, though. They've left a few remnants here, just either for historical preservation or just because it's, less expensive to just leave some of these supports here. So they have some of these here, but then they also have these ones down in the deeper parts of the water. They've removed some of them so that boats can get through here because we do have some recreational boats that go down the river. And then they've left the ones that aren't so much in the way. They've just left those there. To make it a lot easier on myself later, I wanted to, as usual, level this area out so that we don't have to worry about too many slope issues, although that didn't really hold up, as you'll see later. But anyway, I'm also upgrading this road just to get a sense of scale of what this avenue used to look like. And then we're going to come in and line up the wharf alongside the road. I just ended up doing it manually. This would have worked really well with the parallel feature of Network Multitool, which is a mod we'll be installing fairly soon in the series. You've probably heard me mention this before, but I can be kind of behind the times when it comes to all these new mods. But anyway, I didn't have Network Multitool at the time, so I just did it manually. I also copied and pasted some gravel roads down underneath just to make sure we get the right elevation at the bottom of the key asset as well. I did the straight sections first, which was pretty straightforward, and then just connected up the curved sections. I did the same thing with the terraforming roads, and then smoothed everything out just to make sure we get a nice smooth transition underwater. Not that you can really see it, but just in case for whatever reason, you have your camera down there, it'll look nice and natural. There's this pedestrian path that runs in from the Riverside District that we made many episodes ago. So obviously we have to hook that up with our park here. And that just connects right up with the quay. We're going to run a invisible pedestrian path through the quay asset so that people can actually walk along it and use it as a park, which is pretty cool. At the Tom McCall Waterfront Park, there's a ferry stop of some sort. I don't know if it's for public ferries or just river tours or whatever. But anyway, Todos Santos does have a public ferry system that's actually used for transportation, which is going to be expanded in a few episodes. It's going to be a lot of fun. But anyway, there's a ferry stop here, and I wanted to integrate that into the wharf. So we're just doing a little bit of PO work with these cool big concrete slab pieces. Just has a slightly different texture from the standard ploppable pavement piece, so I kind of like to use this where I can, just to break up the monotony of the pavement texture every once in a while. Of course, we have stairs so people can get down to it. I needed to have it lowered slightly than the quay, just because it needs to be, right down at the water level. But then, of course, we also need people in wheelchairs to be able to get down, so there's a ramp as well. And some railings, of course, just to keep people from falling off there. These are kind of annoying to make with PO, but straightforward, but just very repetitive. So I try not to do them if I don't absolutely have to. But I felt like the stairs and the ramp were just a little bit bare without anything else, so we have them here. Of course, I did everything at the wrong height, so we need to come back and raise it up just a little bit. So I didn't want to have the entire area here, where the avenue used to be this kind of modern and fancy park. So I imagined there was some sort of compromise made where this area was sold to developers. So there's a more kind of nature walk sort of path with a bunch of trees. And on the other side of the trail, there's going to be a housing development. But we're going to get to that in just a minute. First, we have to finish setting up the basics of the park. And one important part of that, of course, is that there still has to be a road to access this area, because people still need to get there. And Todos Santos is fairly car-centric. I imagine this would be like, maybe there used to be a frontage road next to this really wide avenue or something like that. That seemed to be a pretty common road setup in Latin America, so that's maybe my thought there. But they basically took that and turned that into the main street that runs by the park. So we're going to plop that down, connect it up with this pre-existing road over by the ferry terminal, and then delete the avenue that we were just using as a template. And there you can see just how much space that took up and how much space we're going to have available for our nice park. So I tried a few different network skin settings for how I wanted this road to go. And I ended up settling for a one lane of traffic in each direction with a median in the middle, some nice trees on it, and of course some bike lanes so we can get some bikers going through this part of the city. And we're detailing the terminus of the avenue just to show that this area is blocked off. There used to be a street that went down here, but like we talked about before, that's been removed. And they really don't want you to drive there now. I suppose there are probably people who, hike down that area. It's kind of like an urban exploration thing that certain people do. But most people wouldn't really be interested in going down this probably pretty dangerous area. I also imagine that this project probably took place quite a while ago, so there's been plenty of time for it to become quite overgrown. And it's pretty lush down here by the water. I wanted to add functionality to this place, like I said before. So off screen, I added an invisible park life park entrance so that people are attracted to come to this place. And they do end up coming here, which is pretty sweet. And then I also wanted to add a system of walkways, just using the vanilla elevated walkway to begin with, just to make sure I can get everything to line up. And running it along the length of the quay, all the way to the terminus of the park over here by the bridge. Now that I got everything laid down, just need to line it up with the quay so that people actually walk through it. I assume there are assets that you can use for that now, but I didn't have them, so I did it manually. Anyway, finish that up, and then we're going to change those to invisible paths so that they don't have this ugly fence sticking up through them. One weird result of this is that there's this gap in the terrain between the quay and the land, so I have to come in with some grass terraforming networks and just smooth that out. I think it's worth going through and doing this kind of detail for this area because it looks so much cleaner with that clean line of grass in between there. Although the LOD does look like dirt for some reason, literally like dirt. Don't know why that is. But anyway, here's the final result. We get some Sims walking down the quay there, which is very nice to see. Changing gears a little bit, we need to figure out how to transition between the landscape and this big bridge that soars out over the park that we just made. So I decided just to use retaining walls because why not? At least for this initial part where the bridge leaves the hill, just because it looks kind of cool. And, you could imagine that they did some earthworks here and then just did normal bridge supports for the rest of it. And of course, we need some trees up here since there's grass. Might as well. Now, we had this steep slope and this fairly high abutment, so I wanted to do something that I've noticed in various interchanges and other overpasses and bridges, it took a while for me to find the name, but apparently it's called slope paving. And it's basically just used to reinforce the earthworks, I guess, and prevent erosion. Kind of makes sense that they'd want this sort of thing here, so I just painted down some pavement and added some decals. I imagine that there's been like a lot of water that runs down here, so it leaves some residue on there. So we have some decals representing that, and it's very mossy and moist at the bottom where everything collects. Anyway, I'm pretty happy with how this came out. I think it adds a nice little bit of a break to all the buildings that we're going to place down, starting right about now. Well, first, before we place buildings, we have to place down a road network. So we have a very steep road that runs right up against the slope paving there, whatever it's called, and connects up with this neighborhood that we made a long, long time ago, like 20-something episodes ago. And, the assets available to this game have just increased so much in the intervening time between then and this build, and the builds I've been doing more recently. But it's still, I feel like at this point, as a builder, I was kind of at a transition point where earlier I hadn't been as careful as to like the realism of the building placement, and it was kind of more just plopping down what buildings I have, still considering the zoning and everything, but not worrying too much about architectural styles or, if there's setback parking or all that sort of stuff. So at this point in the series, I still hadn't quite transitioned to putting a little bit more TLC into and consideration into that kind of build. So I placed a lot of buildings, and I'm not like super happy with it, but I think it works well enough as a background for the main point of the build, which is the park. But I am going to cut out most of the building placement footage for this episode, just because I think there's going to be a lot more interesting stuff coming that just represents what I'm going for a little bit better. I will, however, definitely show you the rest of the road network, because I'm pretty happy with that. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, mostly just a bunch of rectangular blocks, nothing wrong with that. And there will be some glimpses here and there into some of the more interesting parts of basically just the strip of commercial that we put along this small avenue. And then there are some higher density neighborhoods behind it. And a lot of parking. Basically any gap that I had in between all these more or less randomly placed buildings, I added a bunch of cars to fill it in. Some of the more interesting parts of filling in this area are this totally innocuous and non-threatening statue that sits at the intersection of these two roads here. This little paved pathway that runs between two areas of development. And this dual set of apartment buildings that I really love this asset, and I thought they looked cool sticking up next to the freeway here. There was a bit of an unwieldy slope though, so I had to do a little bit of kind of lazy retaining wall stuff just to make it look a little bit more realistic, without worrying too much about, spending hours and hours detailing this little block that no one's ever going to see again. One part of this build that I'm actually really happy with is this little apartment development along the river that I was talking about before. Or not the river, the bay. So what I did is I clipped two of these modern-looking apartment buildings together, plus one of the accompanying garage assets, and basically treated that as one building and set them alongside these little driveways. Fixed the garage with PO so that it doesn't overlap with the trail, and it actually comes together very satisfyingly, getting rid of that gap there. And then we take this whole construction and copy and paste it all the way along this avenue here, just kind of rotating it slightly to get along with the street. So we got this place all detailed up, and like I said, I'm just really happy with how this came out. I think it looks really nice along the waterfront. Of course, we have this big space behind here, so I'm just going to come in and add some more of this development. All right, we got that done. Now it's time to detail the park. So I started here on the eastern edge of the park, just extending the kind of aesthetic logic of the slope paving here. I felt like it needed to have concrete underneath these gigantic supports. I'm not really sure how realistic that is, but anyway, just detailing it up in kind of a similar way with a bunch of expansion joints, some tufts, and then some wetness decals just to make it look like there's water collecting here as well. And at this transition point under the bridge between the nice park and the kind of nature walk park, there's kind of a not so nice area where people throw their trash. And there's some poor soul living here in a tent, using the bridge like 100 feet above for cover. And then as a visual buffer in between this not-so-nice area and the main portion of the park, we have a little trail and then just a single industrial building with a parking lot and some trees to visually cover up this area from anyone who's in the park. Now for the park proper, we're actually going to get into some details. In the real-life inspiration, there is quite a bit of wear and tear in the grass. I assume just where people, walk back and forth in the park. Makes sense. Seems pretty reasonable. So I'm just using these dirt paths and connecting them up to the main walkways in this kind of like barbell shape. I didn't feel like doing two paths like the original version kind of has like two parallel paths like this. I just wanted to do one just to kind of make it look a little bit less worn down, and also it's just easier to build this way. So I'm just setting up a base with these paths, and then we're going to cover up the base with these dry grass decals that just look so good. I mean, I'm sure you know if you've watched the series before. I use these all over the place. They just have a really nice look, and they'll blend in really with any grass texture that you have. But they're pretty small, so they do get a little repetitive. So I also use Surface Painter just on the single brush size setting and remove most of the texture that comes with the dirt path, just so we can get kind of a splotched look, just to vary the look here underneath the dry grass. Before I could detail the area around the ferry terminal, I needed to figure out how the buses worked here. Because obviously your public transit lines are going to potentially shift how you detail an area based on where the stops are or where the traffic goes or whatever. So we have this green line that I'm adjusting. This runs along the river, along the Riverside District, and I end up turning it into a bus line that just really skirts around the whole downtown peninsula. And it meets up at this central bus station that, like I mentioned last episode, we're going to replace in the future with something a little bit more logical. But I do like how this bus line turns out. Just runs along this avenue that we built, and then it's going to hook up with the ferry stop as well. I think it would have been cool to extend that light rail line, the red line, all the way out here to the ferry, but I didn't think to do that, or maybe I did and I didn't want to, but either way it didn't happen, so we just have buses meeting up here, which is fine. The area by the ferry terminal is going to be like a fairly developed park, but I wanted this little natural spot that remains on the shoreline. I thought it was kind of a cool area. You could have people come down here and hang out by the water without having to worry about turning it into a big beach or anything like that. Now earlier I mentioned that I wanted to not have a slope problem here, but of course we still ended up having one on this main part of the park. So I decided to actually use that to our advantage here and do some interesting detailing. Now at first I tried just flattening the whole area out. That didn't really work, so I just ignored the problem for a little bit and decided to do this little detailed circular area. And of course one problem here is that I wanted the texture of the quay to match the texture of this sunken area in the park. And I figured, why not just use the quay itself for the texture? It doesn't have to actually go along the waterfront. So I do that. And then one unexpected bonus of doing it that way is that you can then just use the quay to bridge the elevation gap. So you have this nice smooth slope from the road down to the park. Now I wanted this to be a pretty central park for the city. So I have this little kind of random monument to like the maritime history of Todos Santos. So there's a big anchor pointing to the sky. I assume there's intended to be some symbolism there. And then these random concrete planters that I made really tall with PO, and that's kind of meant to symbolize like the urban development of Todos Santos, like the skyline of the city. A little cheesy, but it is what it is. And then I didn't think it was cool just to have a bunch of circles inset in one another, so I have this grass circle, and I decided to turn it into this C shape with a little seating area there, which I thought was kind of nice. And some flowers and trees, of course. I'm sure that it was bothering you as much as it was me that it wasn't centered, so there you go. Also, this pathway wasn't quite wide enough. Again, this is meant to be a really big and busy central park, so I needed to extend that by a couple times, and then also put some retaining walls in here because we're going to have some sunken areas on either side of the pathway. And then we're going to fill it in with a little sports complex, some bike parking and bike rental, and a little kind of impromptu botanical garden. That's not really an official botanical garden, but there's a big variety of Todos Santos foliage there, so we'll just call it a botanical garden. Now that we've got the park all detailed up, I wanted to run a consistent line of trees along the walkway here. So in the Portland inspiration for this build, they have cherry blossoms. I don't think we're going to have cherry blossoms in Todos Santos. That just doesn't really strike me as realistic. I could be wrong. But I'm just using this standard set of trees that I really like using throughout the city. We have acacias, the black frost, and that's it. Just those kind of alternating more or less randomly all the way along the park. Also have this little bus stop here. This is what I was talking about. Sometimes your transit lines are going to affect how you detail things. I had this little setback area here, so I just thought it would be a nice spot to add in a bus stop that's a little bit more detailed than what we usually do. Now there are just a few more details to bring this park together. We have some fencing. I wanted to run this all the way along the avenue just to keep the cars and bikes as separate from the park and the pedestrians as possible. So we have this bright iron fence that I just really like using. It looks pretty cosmopolitan. You could use it in any city in most situations where you want something that looks fairly nice and well maintained, like we do for this park. And I'm just leaving gaps that we're going to come back and manually fill in where people either enter the park or where there's a bus stop along the road. I like using props for this kind of adjustment just because it's a lot easier to do and you have a little bit more precise control over exactly where they stop and go. I mean, you can adjust the before and after offset in IMT, which is really handy and works a lot of the time, but sometimes you just need to get a little bit more precise. I'm using the same set of trees running along the road as well. I thought it looked a little bare just to have them on one side, so I wanted to cover up the whole park. And I mean, it's me, so of course I'm going to do that. But I thought I'd mention my rationalization for putting all those trees down. It wouldn't be an episode of Todos Santos without a giant parking lot, so we have a giant parking lot that is here, and it exists. You have to pay to get in. This is probably like a park and ride area, or maybe it's like if you're an employee at the park or the ferry or whatever, maybe you could park there. Really, I just didn't know what to put here, and I thought a parking lot just seemed kind of fitting. Also have a couple facility buildings, maybe like a tourist information center and a restroom or something. There's a somewhat of a transit hub here just for people waiting for a bus or the ferry, some benches and trees, and trash cans and maps, the usual kind of details that you would expect. Now, of course, a lot of this place is custom made with PO and networks and stuff, so we need to come back and add some lighting. And I'm using these Parisian lamps, which I think look really nice, although the multi-bulb versions seem to only have one bulb light up, which I don't really like, so I usually stick with the single bulb version if I actually want to see these lit up at night. So go all the way along the quay, and then we do the same thing with these access paths, just to make sure everything's lit up, because people would probably want to come here at night, at least occasionally. For the main central plaza here, I have taller versions of the Parisian lamps, which I think look really nice, and they serve to light up the area pretty well. I thought about maybe having the bike parking and the sports area closed off at night, so I could have some pipe fences and gates set up there just so that it could be shut, but I just decided against it. And if people want to come here at night and do nefarious things, I don't really care, as long as they clean up after themselves. I also have these Malecone lights, which give off a nice orange glow and just add a little bit of stateliness to this park. Well, that's about it for this episode of Todos Santos. I really hope you enjoyed your time in the city today, and I can't wait to see you on the next one. Bye-bye.